Thank you, Deputy President, and I'm very pleased to rise to speak to Mr Grimley's motion today. It's frightening. 87% of people who are sexually assaulted don't report that assault to the police. So something is terribly wrong about that process. And I know this government is introducing some legislation around victims of crime compensation, but what we need to do is change some of the structure and some of the systems in place to make it easier for people to report those crimes. I think also, fundamentally, we need to be working further and further to prevent those crimes from occurring, and that requires really ground-up cultural change, and we saw that in the Royal Commission into Family Violence. That this is as basic as around equality and a whole range of other issues that lead to violence against women. But it's not only women who experience sexual violence, but it's mainly them. And as the motion states, the Victorian Law Reform Commission recently looked into sexual violence and reported late last year. It was a very expansive report and it made numerous recommendations, but principally it made it clear that the system needs to change. So that when the system is in place, that it's straightforward, and it's not traumatic for people who experience sexual violence. And this we heard throughout our most recent inquiry into the criminal justice system, that the processes are not trauma-informed, that the processes in our justice system do not, it can quite often further traumatise someone. They want to see, and this is survivors of violence, they want to see the criminal justice system hold people responsible. The people who are responsible for that sexual violence, they must be held to account. But how they're held to account varies. So there has been lots of discussions even around restorative justice in this area, which, I know when we were doing the Mr Grimley's inquiry into sex offender information, a number of the victim survivor organisations said, we just don't want the perpetrator to do it again. We just don't want it to happen again. Sorry. Now, we need to look at why people don't report to the police. As I said, 87% don't report to the police. People don't think that they'll be believed, or they don't want to go through that criminal trial, and I totally understand that. And when we heard from people talking about their experiences in the court system, their experiences of having to come face to face with the perpetrator, when they wrote victim impact statements, the fact that their perpetrator could actually amend those statements, could question what they were saying in their victim impact statements. So there's lots of areas that we can reform in this, and I know the VLRC has made a significant number of recommendations, but as has the Legal and Social Issues Committee's inquiry into the criminal justice system, and we certainly looked at better ways to provide trauma-informed systems, to provide systems where victims can be heard and feel like they have been heard. And I think we heard this time and time again, that the victim sometimes felt like a bystander in the case. And that's sort of how our system works. Quite often it's the public prosecutor prosecuting the case, and the victim becomes almost just a witness in their own experience of violence. And I think we need to do this, we need to change this. So we need to embed trauma-informed practices into the design of our justice system, and it needs to be more accessible, which means people coming forward make it easier for people to come forward, and it has to be, for many people, it actually has to be less of an adversarial, because quite often it's that adversary that is absolutely frightening, and it's the reason why people do not want to go through with the process, because the process is frightening. It feels like they're having to set themselves up for a battle. Now, I share Mr Grimley's concerns that we should have been working on this for decades. And we've been tinkering around the edges, but we haven't got there. And as I said right at the onset, change has to happen in the community. We have to understand that we do not accept any form of violence. But as I've also said, the system needs to change. The VLRC has made some really broad recommendations, but we need to understand sexual violence. We need to understand what it is, how it permeates some of our culture, and we need to support the people who experience it. People still don't want to talk about it. People, standing up and talking about sexual violence, we've seen Grace Tame, we've seen some really brave women starting to stand up and talk about the sexual violence that they've experienced in different areas. But it is still difficult. It is still difficult, and I would suggest that probably the majority of women who've experienced sexual violence have not stood up publicly and talked about it. Many of them may have not told a single soul about it, or maybe told just their closest friend or family. So we need to find the tools, and we need to find the ways to enable people to talk about sexual violence, to be able to report it. And there are many barriers, and I think the VLRC report goes into this. We also need to talk about public education. Stopping sexual violence should be everyone's business. Organisations like clubs and schools and employers should have stronger obligations to do what they can to eliminate sexual violence and harassment. And I'd actually like to do a shout out to the Fitzroy Football Club. They have been doing some extraordinary work around addressing sexual violence. They have been working with their men's teams and their women's teams. They've been bringing professionals in there to have some really hard conversations with club members. And from all accounts, it has been incredibly positive for not only the women in that club, but also the men. But the system for responding to sexual violence is under strain. We heard victim support services, police, lawyers, they're all overworked and under-resourced. So getting assistance and finding an intermediary to help you in the court system quite often just is not possible, because they just don't exist, and particularly if you're in regional areas. So we need to create a system that's straightforward and effective. And I can see that the government is doing this, but it's a big. There's a lot more to be done. I think the VLRC has said this needs to be across government. It can't just be the Justice Department. We need to look at the Health Department. We need to look at education. We need to look at policing. It needs to be across the board. It is a big task, but I would implore the government to prioritise this for the victims of sexual violence and all Victorian women. Thank you.